Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar on plans examiners and the Energy Code. The webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be sent out to all attendees. They are posted to the Code Adoption Toolkit as well. So there's a drop down on the Code Adoption Toolkit with all of our past webinars if you're interested in reviewing any of those. If there are any issues with audio, please write me in the chat. My name is Erica DeLello, and I'm a project manager for Noresco. This series is sponsored by the Colorado Energy Office with training materials created by the Mozingo Code Group. So Shauna and I have been working with the Colorado Energy Office to provide trainings just like this one. And here I have listed out the trainings that are offered in this series for the next few months. There will be a link sent out in a follow-up email if you'd like to register for any of the other webinars. And we're also offering tailored group trainings. So if you have a group, if your company is or your jurisdiction would like to get trained by Shauna or one of the other subject matter experts, you can put a request in. We're also helping out with technical assistance for code adoption. So if you're looking at adopting the 2018 or 2021 energy codes or any of the codes, actually, CEO is covering the full suite of iCodes and REACH codes for technical assistance. Feel free to reach out to me and I can get you set up with some free technical assistance. So most of you probably know about the Code Adoption Toolkit and all of the resources available, but today I wanted to highlight our latest resource, which is the Code Helpline. The helpline is available to anyone in Colorado on any of the iCodes or REACH codes. So for example, if you're a jurisdiction and need assistance on a planner review or a homeowner or engineer with a question about code applicability, you can submit a ticket and a subject matter expert will get back to you in just a couple days' time. You can access this helpline through the Code Adoption Toolkit as well, or through the link posted here. And just a couple of housekeeping items throughout the webinar. We do want to encourage questions, so please use that Q&A function and I'll let our presenter know at the end of the presentation. There's also the ability to raise your hand and ask a question directly, and I can then unmute you. And lastly, there will be a survey window that pops up following the webinar. Please take a moment to fill out that feedback and so we can continue to improve on these webinars and develop other resources for the building industry. So today's presenter is Shauna Mozingo, and she is the president of Mozingo Code Group, as well as a plans analyst and inspector for jurisdictions. Over the past 8 years, maybe closer to 10 now, she's provided code adoption assistance and training to code officials, builders, energy raters, and designers. And she's been a past president of the ICC Colorado chapter and has served on the IECC code development and correlation committees for the 2018, 2021, and is it 2024 as well? Yep, so 2024 is already kicking off. So. Right, with that, Shauna, I will stop sharing my screen and let you take it from here.
Okay, let's see. I have two screen choosers. I don't know which one it wants me to share, but we'll try this one. Is that my presentation? You see it?
Oh, yes, it looks good.
Oh, okay, perfect. All right, woohoo! So excited to share this with you today. It's been a while since I taught a webinar, so bear with me. One thing that I will say is there's no way, I don't know what your expectations are, but there's no way to get through a plan review in an hour, especially when it's, what is it, residential or commercial or both. So really what I want to do so that you're not leaving more confused than when you started is to just attempt in the next hour to walk you through some strategies that I use, some ideas to think about, and then show you some new code sections so that we can figure out how to identify them on the plan and how to write up comments if we need to. We're also going to look at how to take what we know and pass that on to the designers and the contractors. But first, I really want to just take a minute to ask you to think about your inspectors. So do plan reviewers and inspectors see eye to eye in your jurisdiction? Sometimes you're facing the same direction. You're in the building department, you're facing the same direction, but you're paddling in opposite directions and you end up going in circles. I've worked for a few jurisdictions, and so I know that plan reviewers don't often think that inspectors are looking at the comments in the field, and maybe they never open the set of plans on the job site, and maybe the inspectors think that the plan reviewers are incompetent and can't call things on the plan. So they just they think they do a better job just finding things on their own on inspection. I've worked in several jurisdictions where, we're just not in sync with each other. And so we form our own opinions. A lot of time there's division between the two. So just an experience. I remember sitting in a staff meeting once where the whole staff is there for the building department, and an inspector just blurted out how incompetent us plan reviewers were, right? And at first I kind of sank in my chair, but then I put a lot of thought into how I could change that perception and the attitude in my department. So I started by taking plans back to the inspector and asking him, what do you want to see on the plans? What would help you? What is it that we're missing? You show me what would help you on the plans. What comments help them do their job better? What is it they're looking for? And at first I got a little resistance, like, oh, it's not up to me to help you do your job. But eventually they were kind of glad to see me coming to them, and we'd talk about the code requirements, and sometimes I'd show them where I knew a code requirement was different than they thought it was, or sometimes I'd learn from them. But mostly it just got this conversation started and showed them that I was interested in their job, what they needed to do a better job, and how could I help them. Eventually, they became interested in my job. They became interested in what I thought. I was no longer incompetent. I was their coworker, and we were in the same boat, rowing in the same direction and in sync. So we could have, we started having casual conversations about how I was dealing with different designers and how many times I had actually reviewed the plans, how many comments that I had really made. Truthfully, the inspector sees the final set of plans. They don't know what you went through to get there, right? And so I started sharing those experiences about how many times it took me to review the plans, how, just having those conversations. And then they'd open up to me about, here's what I found on the job site. I went to open the plans to say, hey, look, we're arguing over this thing. It's right here on your plans, only to find it wasn't on the plans, and so we just started talking about each other's jobs and just started working out our issues. So we got to take turns. Sometimes the plan reviewers, what I also was allowed to do is I would ask the building official, hey, this is a simple little tenant finish. Do you care if I give it to one of the inspectors to do? And they would do their plan review, see what it took to really go through that. A little resistance, of course, at first, but then we would say, we're just really swamped. Could you do this? This is, of course, before the days when they had 50 inspections a day. And then we also got to go out with them occasionally on the job site to see what they were going through and how they could open up a set of plans and it wasn't there, or the comment was really, really vague and it didn't help them, or whatever. And so we started living in each other's worlds and seeing things, and it really made a difference in how I did plan review, especially when it comes to energy code, because there's so many different codes everybody has to know, and energy code sometimes takes the bottom of the totem pole. So just taking the time to really figure out how you can be in sync on some of those really makes a difference. And so I would just encourage you as we go through today, not only to think about your contractor and your designer, but to think about your inspector. What would help them on the set of plans as we go through this today? And how can you better that relationship so you're rowing in the same direction? Another thing to think about is, what is the purpose of plan review? Well, yeah, sure, to make sure that the design meets all the applicable codes and that the building's safe and healthy and efficient. But is there more to it than that? Or could there be more to it than that? Do you find yourself with designers that you absolutely you love reviewing their plans because you can trust them, you know that they're competent and they're going to put all the stuff on the plans, you only are going to have one or two comments, and you probably can just identify those on the plans, stamp them and approve them and get them out the door. But then you have those other guys, right? Their plans you have to really pick through with a fine-tooth comb because they either you have a history with them of trying to sneak things in or not doing their due diligence, not doing their work. And so you have I've had designers that after 10 to 20 comments, sorry, here's your plans back, start over. Sometimes they just want you to create their list because they don't really know the code, and so they just want you to create the list of things they need to change, and they'll change just those items, right? And so you have this history of things, of different designers that you work with, and so it gets kind of frustrating. So we're going to see maybe later on how we could, by how we word our plan review comments, or how we look at things, how we put things on the plans, how we could take that knowledge transfer that we have and pass it on to the designers, pass it on to the contractors in the field if they open their plans. And so really looking at, as we go through today, I guess I would just ask you also to think about how could you word something to help yourself. Really, in the end, you're helping yourself because you are helping the contractor learn, you're helping the designer learn a code requirement by how and what you write on the plan or write in your plan review comments. And so if you write it enough times, they're gonna get tired of seeing it, and they're gonna start just putting it on the plans, ultimately helping yourself. How do you cut down on your time on plan review? Help them learn. Is it your job to teach them? Probably not. Does it help you? Absolutely. And so it's just a different mindset of doing plan review. I just got to get this done. Well, you don't have to get so much done. You don't have to review it 50 times because you've taught them, right? You've taught them how to put things on the plan. And like I said, we all have to know a lot of different codes. So the more you can put on the plans to educate as you go, maybe save yourself time in the future. So another thing to think about. All right, let's talk about this energy code. We've talked a lot in the past about a house as a system or a building as a system, right? So how components have to be, they all affect each other. How does the envelope and the lighting system affect the mechanical system, that sort of thing. Well, the energy code includes so many different building elements, so many different trades, so many different options. We need to think of this code as a system as well. What someone might choose in section 402, the envelope section, will probably have an effect on what they have to do in 405, the lighting system, right? Depending on how many windows if you're in a commercial building, how many windows you put in affects the lighting controls you have to put in. What path you choose, are you going prescriptive, performance, that sort of thing, will definitely affect what you do in all the other sections. So really thinking about this code as a system. We have admin provisions. A lot of people write their own. We have definitions. Energy code, above all other codes I have found, the definitions really help you figure out how to apply something. What is a conditioned space? That you have to know that in order to apply this whole code. What is a greenhouse? There are new greenhouse requirements for commercial buildings. You better look at that definition of greenhouse, right? Climate zones. We need to know our climate zones for sure. They changed in 2021, so make sure that you're looking at the right climate zone, especially if you're a plan reviewer for, like a third-party plan review. I do plan review for Aspen. Oh, that's climate zone 7. Okay, Westminster, you're climate zone 5. You need to know those climate zones. That's how this code is written. Right. So what compliance option did they choose? That's really important. Did they go prescriptive performance? You do not want to be giving them the wrong requirements or turning them down for something when that's not even an option they chose. Then you go through the envelope, mechanical, water, power, lighting. There's things in there on additional efficiency package options. When do they apply? When do they have to look at those? Doesn't apply to every single building, and it definitely doesn't apply to existing buildings. So how do we know that? Commissioning now in the 2021, commissioning doesn't just mean mechanical systems anymore, or just lighting controls. We have building envelope commissioning come into play. So commissioning takes on a new meaning. Then you have all your appendix chapters, and then of course documentation and verification. So it's a system, and we want to think of it that way. When we start doing our plan review and we start making comments on one, oh shoot, how did that affect this over here? I might have to make a comment over here. So just keep that in mind. Another thing I want to just mention is in the energy code in chapter 1, it gives all these things. Okay, these are the things that have to be on the plan to show, to be able to verify energy code compliance. And it gives you this nice little list, right? What compliance path, they have to tell you what path they chose now. Did they go prescriptive or performance or whatever? What RV values, solar heat gain, U factor, everything about the mechanical design system, mechanical sizes, efficiencies, types. Did they, residential, did they size it with manual J? Commercial, did they do their equipment sizing? That's something that, probably 1 out of 20 plans that I get for commercial buildings, they turn in their equipment sizing because nobody asked for it because they don't know how to review it. So it's probably one of my top 10 plan review comments. Please provide your load calculations, because they just don't do it on commercial very often. Nobody's asking for it. Equipment and system controls, do they have all of their sequence of operations, all their thermostats, all their controls, all of their demand control, ventilation, lighting controls? Are all the controls listed on there? Duct sealing, now it's required that on the plans they document their duct sealing and duct and pipe installation and location. We're going to see when we get into some of the code requirements some new stuff. And so how do they do that? Do they just say, oh, we're going to seal our ducts? We're going to have all our ducts in conditioned space, so we're going to test them. How do they tell you on the plans what they're doing? A lot of times it's in a note or a comment, and it does require air sealing details. This is just residential, but I just want to give you an example of, it does require these air sealing details because we don't want them to get all the way to final where they fail a blower door. Like, we want to give them a roadmap to 3 air changes per hour and help them succeed. And so they're supposed to put those details on the plans. But the other thing I want to point out is in chapter 1, if you don't amend chapter 1, section 103.3.1 tells you have to, once you've reviewed, you sign it and you send it out the door with a stamp. And the code is specific to say that the stamp says reviewed for code compliance. What does your stamp say? Approved, a date, a sign. I guess I would just, if we're going to ask them to go by the letter of the code, maybe we better look at this section and make sure our stamp says what the code says, or amend the code to say what the stamp says. But just something, a lot of people don't pay attention to that, to the things in chapter 1. So I want to bring that up. Another thing to point out is in both residential and commercial, all the previous code editions had this section that said, it's mandatory by it, meaning I can't trade it off no matter which path I choose, or it was prescriptive. They took that away. They said it was too confusing. And so just want to remind you that just because the word went away doesn't mean that the requirement went away. It really meant, when it said mandatory, it just meant these are all the things that apply to you that you can't trade off if you choose a performance path, right? So instead, they just left everything, took the word away. The requirement is still there. You have to do it. If you go performance, they just made it a table in that performance path saying, hey, here's the things you can't trade off. Because that's when it applied anyway. So they just, to take the confusion away, they took it out of the main body of the code and just put it over. If you go into the performance, ERI path or performance paths, that's where you're going to find these tables. So none of that changed. It's all still required. It still can't be traded off. It's just listed in a different place. So remember that when you are going through and doing your plan review. Another thing, even though it doesn't necessarily say it in that list of things that you have to comply with, is very important that you call out the thermal envelope. They have to depict the thermal envelope on their plan. What do they consider to be in conditioned space and not? A lot of times I see it like this, a section of a building. Okay, well, so their attic is outside the envelope. Then I know my insulation and air barrier need to be right here. If the attic was inside, then here I need to make sure I have my insulation and air barrier here. You know, is the crawl space inside or outside? If I know what they're doing, I know where to look for things. And so it is now a requirement in the code that they depict that thermal envelope on there. I still get plans with it not on there, so I know people aren't calling it. But it really is, if we just get them in the habit of doing it, not just the habit of putting something on the plan. It's the education that goes with putting something on the plan. If I make you depict your thermal envelope, I have just made you think about what is your thermal envelope. And so now I'm have a better chance of you putting the insulation and calling the insulation and the air barriers in all the right places, because you had to put some thought into where is that. So there's reasons for it, right? We don't just put all the time, don't just put things in the code because we want them. All right. Let's get into a few things that we should be aware of for residential plans. First, besides determining that the building's actually residential and knowing your climate zone. So hopefully you know the difference between a residential and commercial building for the energy code. Just highlighting that, you know, residential, anything built out of the IRC plus those multifamily R2s, R3s, and R4s, so not always multifamily, but apartment buildings built out of the IBC, not commercial. They are residential for the energy code if they're 3 stories or less, so we just make sure we know that. I will tell you that some people are changing multifamily to all be commercial. I tried to make that change this cycle in the energy code for ICC to just say, all multifamily will be looked at under the commercial code so that we didn't have this 3 stories or less, 4 stories or more. I wasn't even allowed to submit the proposal. ICC kicked it back to me saying, absolutely not, we're not doing that anymore. People have tried it in the past, we're not doing it anymore. We are sticking by the scope that is in the code, and you're not allowed to ask us to change that. So for those jurisdictions that have done it, you know, we had hoped that we could just do it nationally, but it's not allowed. So 3 stories or less for those R2s, 3s, and 4s will always be residential, at least for now, and 4 stories or more will be commercial. So knowing that, knowing your climate zone, like I said, it could be different this code cycle, so make sure you know that. Then knowing what path they chose, and then knowing, you know, depending on the path they chose, determines what they have to turn in. Yes, they're going to turn in a set of plans, but are you looking for a res check, or are you looking for a performance report? Or are you just looking at the plans? Are you looking for something else? What all of those different paths require a different. Oops, this says U factor alternative twice. All of those different things determine different plans. I know some jurisdictions require a res check no matter what. Res check is for the UA alternative, U factor, or total UA alternative. Oh, they are different. Total UA alternative, and only for that. So if they choose that path, they should have to turn it in. They shouldn't have to turn it in no matter what. And we'll look at why in a second. But one thing I want to point out is you can start in one path and end in another. So at plan review, everything is going great. The designer's like, this is how I designed the building. I'm going to turn in a res check to do stuff. But then construction happens and life happens and things happen in the field and they can't get that window or they can't do that R value or they can't make it work. And so, okay, rerun your res check with what you really did. Maybe it'll work, but maybe it won't. Maybe they fail. They still have the opportunity to go performance. You know, if you start out prescriptive and it doesn't work, you can go to res check. All right, if you can't get that to work, then go performance. If you get to performance and you can't make it work, then you're probably going to have to go back and change something under your construction. But at least go through all the paths to see if you can make it work. You know, it will have to get re-reviewed, but at least you're not tearing apart your building. So there are some things with that to think about. Same with commercial. All right, so some things just about the table real quick. The table is changed, and so making sure on residential that you're looking at the different things and that you're downloading your errata. Go to icc.org errata central. You could just, if you do a Google for errata central, it'll pop up. So errata central, download the errata. There's a lot, especially for that 2021. The things that we're going to talk about today will apply to any code edition, but for the most part, but we're going to specifically talk about 2021 as I go through these slides, because you'll see, you know, here's your prescriptive table. If I go prescriptive, I have to do these things. Yes, there are some changes in there. We're not going to talk about all of those changes. That was in a different class. We're going to talk about how to find them on the plans and what we need to know. The biggest thing that I feel you need to know is there are some errata, especially for commercial buildings. How did I end up with that table right there? And for the R values. So if you look at this, here's our climate zone. Say we're in Denver and we're in climate zone 5. Here's the table right here, right? This is the new 2021 table. There's a lot of errata. So make sure that you're downloading it, because they really had the intent of offering, if you're a 2x6 wall, an R20 plus 5 prescriptively. If you're a 2x4, you still have the opportunity to use 13 plus 10. But they also wanted a cavity only option. So if you just want to do cavity and not a cavity plus continuous, you could do an R30. Might have to change some of your framing, but you have that option. Or if you wanted to do continuous only, you have that option. Sometimes in the first printing of the book, that didn't show up. So make sure that you're downloading the errata to get really what you should be doing in those jurisdictions. Look at your footnotes, read those footnotes, because those footnotes have some new things. If I'm a plan reviewer and I go back to this table and it tells me that I need a 0.30 window, did you read the footnote? Because over here in the footnote, it says, oh, it could be 0.32 in certain climate zones 3 through 8 if you're above 4,000 feet in elevation. Name a place in Colorado. Maybe there's 2 that aren't above 4,000 feet. So now really they're allowed to get 0.32. It's because the way the window's made, sometimes especially if they have that argon gas, once you get over elevation, that gas isn't as good, and so the U factor changes over certain elevations. So just some things, you know, that I'm noticing people are not looking at when they're reviewing their plans. Errata, here's the table. This is the U factor table that's equivalent to that R value table. First printing or so didn't have that. Oh, solar heat gain is now required. Did you catch that? Right? In climate zone 4 residential, we never had a solar heat gain. Now we do. We have to pay attention to that. They forgot to put it in the U factor table. So there's an errata to make sure you add that to the U factor. Look for that solar heat gain. That makes a big difference in equipment sizing. How much heat makes it through the window or not make it through the window. You know, if I have a lot of heat coming through the window in the summertime, I need maybe more air conditioning power, right, to offset that heat. So it does make a difference in equipment sizing. So pay attention to that. When you're using the total UA, that's your res check pass. That's a total UA. This is like saying I have two buildings side by side. I'm gonna look at them side by side. One is if I did it right out of that table, but this is what I want to do. And it's just comparing anything that can be converted to a U factor. So your framing materials, your insulations, your windows, those kinds of things, anything that can be converted to a U factor, it's comparing them side by side, and you can make trades. I can do, instead of R60 in my attic, I can put the R49, as long as somewhere else I do better in a U factor, and so that I can equal out. The most common people use res check to do it. You could turn in your manual calculations. I don't see anybody do it because this is a free software. So couple things to note that I see people missing on the plans when they're doing res check. First of all, res check is supposed to be a mirror of the plan. If the plans say they're doing cavity only insulation, the res check shouldn't show a cavity plus a continuous, right? A lot of times they'll say, oh, well, there's a 2 R value in the framing or the air film in the drywall. No, res check already knows you're doing, there's going to be framing, and it assumes drywall. It assumes best practices for that wall. It knows there's R value in that or U factor in that, and it is calculating that behind the scenes. The only thing you get to do is put the actual R value of insulation. Now, if you're doing like an insulated siding, or you're doing some kind of insulation on the outside or the inside of the building, you can put that there. But most of the time when I see R2, I'm like, wait a minute. What insulation are you using continuously to get an R2? And it's usually them telling me they're counting the drywall. The system already does that. So that's one thing that I see. I see a lot of times people put the wrong climate zone, which affects what is required. So if I put in climate zone 2, I don't need as much insulation, and that's what it's going to compare me to. So I want to make sure that I put the right climate zone in there, and that I put new construction and not alteration. That makes more of a difference on commercial than it does residential. But just making sure that the inputs are correct here. And that it passes, that you got the green line. I can't tell you how many research studies I've done across the state where I go to review plans for a building and I'm like, okay, show me the documents that you approved. And there's a red line right across there. Green means go, red means they didn't pass. So just making sure that everything on here matches the plans. It's supposed to be a mirrored image. This is just a tool. This isn't a technical, scientific document. This is a tool to say, the plan said all of this. Yes, it passes. No, it doesn't. So it's supposed to be a mirror image of that. Really going through, is this the U factor they said on the plans? Is this the R9? Are they showing R19 cavity plus continuous? Just really going through there and noting that. Performance gets a little more complicated sometimes. It's really that same twin house concept. It's just not only U factor. It's looking at the whole building. How does energy move? How does air move in the building? How does air move in your ducts? You know, just looks at all kinds of different things in there. And instead of complying based on U factor, it's complying based on cost. If I built this house, it's going to cost me $100 a year for energy, but the way I want to build it has to equal the same or less in energy cost per year. So you're looking at a report, usually done by an energy rater because it requires certified users for the software. There's a lot of software. The two most common, Ecotrope and REMrate. Energy Gauge is used in Florida. RightSoft is coming out. I just hardly see it used anymore, mostly for equipment sizing, but they're, you know, why not come out with an envelope software or envelope compliant software, because you are having to enter everything about the envelope to figure out what size equipment you need. So they came out with that. Reading the reports, the things that I see the most. When you're reading these reports, again, a mirrored image of the plans, whatever they say they're putting in the building, that's what you should see. 2x6s, 16 inches on center or 24 inches on center really makes a difference. In U factor, less wood, better U factor, right? So if they're doing 24 inches on center or 16, or if they're doing 16 but calling it 24 on one of these documents to get a better credit, things to know, right? What insulations, what windows, but this also has a cost shown on it. This is an older report, but the idea is the same. It tells you if I built this house to code, here's how much it would cost. Here's how I designed it. Here's how I designed it. This cost needs to be less than this cost, equal to or less. I have seen them come in with a much higher cost. And down here, it'll say it does not meet. So are you reading it, right? The cost is less and it says that it meets the code, and it meets the code for the edition that you're on, not an older edition, right? So those are the main things that I see plan reviewers messing up. It will also tell you the mandatory requirements that are in the code and whether they've looked at them. It's really a check button that they click in the software, so it doesn't, you know, I usually still look at the plans to make sure I see all of those things on the plans. So some things to look at on a plan review report. Now, the software will also do a res check or a UA calculation. So you can see that it passed. This is the same house. It passed for cost. But when we look at their overall UA, it has a higher UA than if they built it to code. So it totally does not pass UA. That's good to know. Some houses will pass both ways, but it's good to know that, all right, they didn't pass UA, they only passed performance. So if anything changes in the field, I really need to be paying attention to this because there's not another pass that passed performance, right? If they don't pass performance and they don't do everything towards performance, then we need to pay more attention. If it passed UA and they didn't do everything, I still have the performance path to go to. So this is some things to keep in mind. All right, I better get moving here. ERI path, that is your energy rating index path, you know, that's using a score. So some things to keep in mind, those reports, it's the same people, it's the same things, the things that I see. You're allowed to trade off more. So there are some things, if you put solar on, there are limits to what you can trade. So you really want to pay attention to that. You're not allowed to just trade whatever you want and throw solar on to lower that score. There are some backstops in there. When I see the reports, I'm really looking to see, did it meet? No, does not meet. Why doesn't it meet? Oh, it's got a score. It says it failed. It has a score of 65. Oh, what is the score that's required? Oh, well, if I'm in climate zone 5, it needs a 55 to pass. Sorry, go back, right? I can tell you, I see a lot of plans coming in that have failing documents because nobody's reviewing them, they're just accepting them. So I'm just trying to give you a couple little things to look at. Even if you don't do a full-fledged go through it, make sure everything lines up, at least look to see if it passed or failed, right? So mechanical, there's some things in mechanical, you know, do they have their thermostat? Did they insulate their piping? A lot of that didn't change residentially. Did they size it? Do they have their controls outside so the boiler's not running all the time if it's warm enough outside to melt the snow, if they have a snow melt system? But there are some new requirements for ducts. And so I want to run you through that real quick. And how do you call that out on the plan? You know, it's revised to really clearly define ducts inside the envelope versus outside condition space, or in condition and outside condition space, tells them how to insulate the ducts outside the envelope, or even ducts buried beneath the building or underground. All of that got defined in here, and when you can use thermal TDE, thermal distribution efficiency, as an equivalent to an R value. So all of that a little bit more defined in there, but there's also a change to ducts within the thermal envelope that are, it's really specific now about how to deal with ductwork in a floor or a wall, an exterior wall, and when they are considered in the envelope or not. So really just pay attention to that duct system and to those code sections on the duct system. But what I really want to point out is the biggest of these changes is the requirement that is added by actually removing an exception to now mandate that all ducts get tested, whether they're in the envelope or outside the envelope, right? So they removed, it used to give you this whole duct system requirements for testing, and then it said, except ducts within the envelope. That exception went away, right? It's how do you read the code book? We're going to go over this in a couple of sections. How do you read it? The exception is removed, so now all ducts get tested. All it says, though, is that if it's within the envelope, you can have a higher leakage rate than if it's outside the envelope. And if you go performance, you could trade off the leakage rate. But if it's prescriptive, you do this. So there are things about how you read the code. That's why I'm saying this code is a system. How you look at what path they chose or where the ducts are, how things are in the envelope affects mechanical. So really keeping that whole system mindset going when you're going through this code. So making sure that you're okay, the ducts are in the envelope and you chose performance. All right, your ducts can leak this much, but you can trade it off. Oh, you went prescriptive or res check. Okay, your ducts are in the envelope, they can leak this. The ducts outside the envelope can only leak this, and you can't trade it off, right? And so there's just knowing how to use the code and knowing how to read it. Lighting has changed a little. Lighting is something we don't spend a lot of time putting on the plans. Like, oh, you got all your, 100% high efficacy lights. All right, great. You got 100% high efficacy lights. Maybe they never even mention what kind of light bulbs they put in on a residential plan. So you make a plan review comment, required to have 100% high efficacy lights, right? It used to be 90, it was 75, it was 50. It just keeps going up, 100%. Now, there are some new requirements in there, though. New lighting controls is brought in that requires either dimmers or occupancy sensors or other controls that are built into the fixture to be installed. So it does provide some exceptions in there for like bathrooms and hallways and that sort of thing. So making sure that you're looking, not only did they put in the right light bulbs, do they have the right light switches, right? It's not enough to have a high efficient light bulb. You have to turn it off when you're not using it. And so those things are in there that you need to, and how do you write that on the plan? Do you turn down the plans because they don't have the right lighting controls? Can you make it as a comment? If you make it as a comment, is there a way to word it that they're going to remember it and they're going to put it on future ones? Sometimes I will reject a set of plans and tell them, hey, you have these requirements, even though I probably could have, depends. It goes back to that, what kind of designer am I dealing with? If it's somebody that I know I'm always going to deal with, I'm going to reject the plans and say, hey, these are the things that need to be on the plan. And I'll just keep doing it until they do it. Might cost me some more time. But if it's, there might be times where I say everything else on the plan is great. They just didn't identify their light bulbs. Hey, put in 100% high efficacy light bulb. So there's just different ways. It depends on the end result I'm trying to achieve here and what the rest of the plans look like. New section for exterior lighting for R2, R3, and R4 buildings that requires them to meet commercial exterior lighting requirements unless they put in all high efficient light bulbs outside. So how are we going to mark that on the plans? Are we going to turn them away? Are we going to bring them back? We're going to talk about this more when we get into commercial when it comes to lighting, but it also goes back to think about your inspector. Does your inspector licensed, the electrical inspector is licensed to the NEC? He's looking at NEC requirements. Is he going to look at these requirements? I don't know. Who's going to look at energy code? At least get it on the plan and get the contractor, give the contractor a chance to get it right, even if the electrical inspector isn't looking at it. All right, one other section on reading the code. A lot of people, I keep hearing people tell me that the duct test is at, or the ACH, the building envelope leakage test has rolled back to 5 air changes per hour. And it looks like that if you read this section first. They put it in the wrong order. You have to read all the sections, all the subsections to get the big picture. It says the maximum air leakage is 5 changes per hour. But then if you go to the next section, it says when complying with section 40121, which is prescriptive, so prescriptive and res check, the building has to be 3 air changes per hour in our climate zone, which goes back over here to say, oh, it only has to be 5 air changes per hour if you're doing performance or ERI. It's really 3 air changes per hour if you go prescriptive. You have to read all the way through. So what happens when they're writing these codes, a bunch of different code proposals get combined to make what makes it in the code. And so ICC does their best to put them in there in an order, but they put that performance requirement first, which people read that and say, oh, it's 5 air changes per hour. They never continue on to see that this other section is in there. So be aware of that. There's some additional efficiency package options that got into 2021. We need to make sure that those are on the plans, because in order to make that whatever 10% jump that they said we made, it included picking one of these options. And so in 401, it tells you to pick a path. In the path, it tells you when you have to comply with 408, if you're prescriptive or performance, unless you do some other things. So then you go through and pick and figure out which option did they choose. The one thing that I want to show you is in climate zone 7 and 8, there's a new requirement in 21 that they have to put in an HRV or an ERV for their ventilation. If they did that, then, and they're required to already have a tight house, then maybe they shouldn't get credit for tight house and ERV and HRV. They were required to put in an ERV or an HRV. This is like an additional option. That's not an additional option. They were required to do it. So there's just some things you really need to be aware of as you're going through this code. I'm gonna zoom through. We talked about greenhouses. As we're in commercial now, greenhouses is defined, but they also redid it. I just want to plant in your head. We used to say, okay, greenhouses are exempt, grow facilities are exempt. They're not anymore. They're not exempt from envelope, and they're not exempt from lighting. They used to be, but they're not. So pay attention to that section. They've got a whole section on a conditioned greenhouse, unconditioned greenhouse, and it's a little bit confusing, but they're trying to really separate low energy uses from higher energy uses in that section. The table changed. This pink just showed you all the different places that the table changed for commercial buildings. What I want to point out is to really be in the right category, but pay attention to your errata. And the reason I'm really drilling on your errata, because your designer might not download the errata. They might turn in a slab insulation for R20 for 24 inches thinking I'm following the code. They don't have the errata that says, oh, in those climate zones, they have to be for 48 inches. Right. And so you have to reject the plan. Make sure that you have the most up-to-date version, because they might not, and you want to make sure that you're putting in the right thing. ComCheck is still allowed. It's in there for the envelope, or it has mechanical and lighting as well. The biggest things that I find on ComCheck are people not checking for the word other. When you get that ComCheck report, if you see the word other in any of those descriptions, that means they chose something that wasn't normally in ComCheck, and they had to manually enter the value, whether it was an efficiency value or for equipment, or it was a lighting value, or it was an envelope R value or U factor. They manually put it in there because it wasn't in the drop-down list. So it pops up whenever they choose other, it pops up and they get this notification that says, hey, you're going to have to turn in documentation to verify what you just entered. So they know they have to, but they know also who's requiring it and who's not. So whenever you see the word other, just know that means they manually put something in there, and you should double check it. Some other things, projections, a lot of times they're putting in projections when they don't really have one. And if they have a projection, it allows them to get away with a lower UFAC or SH or a higher SHGC, a worse SHGC on their windows for the bigger the projection. So I check for that, make sure that they're not putting projections if they don't have one. But this is nice just to show you the help menu on CommCheck. Really walks you through how to measure things, what to look for, how they looked at it for compliance. So be familiar with that in there. Performance, commercial performance, the reports are different. People get confused. They make them more complicated than it has to be. So I really just want to say, when you're looking at a performance, if somebody goes performance on commercial, don't be freaked out, right? It's like taking a test. When I take a test, I know the code by heart. When I go to take the test, I might get a 70 or a 75 because I freak out when I'm taking a test, right? The same is with these reports. Oh my gosh, it looks so confusing. Where do I start? Start as if you were reviewing a set of plans, if you were reviewing a performance report, I mean, a CommCheck or a res check. Do the things they say in all of these 50 pages match what they're doing on the plan? Are the ducts where they say they are? Are the sizes of the rooms the way they say they are? Are they in the right climate zone? If they say they have 50 pieces of equipment, do they have 50 pieces of equipment, right? If they're saying they're using 2x4s or 2x6s or metal construction, is that what the plans say? Just make sure you're comparing apples to apples and that it's the same cost. Is it going to use less energy at the end of the time than it did before, right? So just don't freak out about it. If you get these and you don't know how to review it, email me. We'll review it together. I mean, or put in a question into the toolkit, into the technical assistant, not technical assistance, but the, code question part, where you can type in a code question. Can somebody help me go through this? One of us will respond to you and we'll go through that with you, right? So don't freak out about it. Just compare it. Are they comparing apples to apples? This one is just to let you know that the U-factor table changed. So when you're reviewing plans for U-factors of glazing for commercial buildings, there are some changes, right? So it's again fixed versus operable instead of type of frame. That's been that way for a while, but U-factor or solar heat gain changed. Used to be northeast, southwest, depending on which way your windows face, determined the U-factor or the solar heat gain. Now is it a fixed window or an operable? Operable can have worse than fixed. And so that's a change. So make sure you're looking at that on your CommChecks and you're looking at that on your plan. This again came in 2021. Make sure that if they're calling out a projection, PF, projection factor, that they get a different U factor for the projection. So you could see, like in climate zone 5, I can go from a 0.33 all the way up to a 0.53. That's huge. So make sure that's going to really affect their mechanical equipment sizing if you let them have a 0.53 and they didn't have a projection. So really, really look at that. And so those are just, make sure you're in the right climate zone and looking at everything for that climate zone. And then a couple things to really point out that have changed for commercial buildings that you're going to need to pay attention to as a plan reviewer. You think of this as an inspection issue. This is, somebody's got to verify blower doors on commercial buildings and air barriers on commercial buildings. It starts with you. It starts with a designer. They might not get it right, but it starts with you. Make sure that it's identified on the plan so you don't get to some other phase of construction only for them to fail, right? We want to build that roadmap to passing. So there's requirements for continuous air barriers. That's always been in there. But now, you have to test if you're a dwelling unit, a commercial dwelling unit, maybe it's a hotel, there's not a hotel, that's not true. There's certain things, if you're dwelling units that are dwelling and sleeping units, that you have to test the building. And then even for those buildings that don't have dwelling units or sleeping units, depending on the size of the building and the climate zone, there are blower door test requirements. So we want to know that, right? We want to know if they're required to test. We need to, like, maybe the first couple times we're going to turn down a set of plans and say, hey, identify how that you're going to have to test this building. Where are those details for that tight envelope, right? And then because there's also this requirement that the air barrier has to be commissioned now. Somebody has to verify with them as they're putting up that air barrier that it is continuous and it's installed correctly. It could be the code official, it could be the designer, it could be a third party, but somebody has to verify that air barrier commissioning, right, of the thermal envelope. Those are new requirements that they're not used to. We're going to need to be their first line of defense on this. We need to be identifying that on the plan. Maybe it's turning it down a time or two until they start identifying on the plan. Just marking it on the plan, sometimes if they don't know the requirement is there, you get out in the field, they're not opening those plans. Is it their fault? Yes. Are we wanting to get to the end and have them fail? No. Is there things we can do? Yeah, we could fail it at plan review once or twice, just some things to think about. Use your resources, make sure every insulation manufacturer, every air barrier manufacturer has a website that shows all the tools, all their lessons learned, what they do, how their product, how it's applied, the challenges they face, the solutions they found. Do they comply with NFPA 285 for that continuous foam insulation outside of a building? Utilize the resources. Yes, it's up to the manufacturer, or it's up to the applicant to give you that information. I still look them all up. I look them up because, you might say, oh, we're just using Tyvek. Well, I know after being an inspector for a long time, Tyvek is very specific on the kind of staple or the kind of nail that you can use. And so I'm putting that on the plan, right? I'm going to set my inspector up for success. When he turns them down, I can go back and say, hey, this was on here. And so I try to do my research. Pretty soon I don't have to because it's in my head. But, if they tell me they're doing this air barrier, Association of America has every air barrier manufacturer on it. And then when you look at it, they have, okay, I just chose the top one. Here's all the details. Here's their install instructions. There's, so I'm doing that research. I only have to do it once or twice and it'll be in my head. But as I'm going through a set of plans, I'm like, oh yeah, you were trying to identify your continuous air barrier around the building, but I know by this manufacturer that you can't do this here, right? It just makes you a better plan reviewer to do a little bit of research when you can. Know your resources. Energycodes.gov, DOE has some great things in there about complying with the codes and how to meet, different insulation requirements and how to do different things. So just doing some research is great. A lot of people doing restaurants. So I just want to point this out real quick. A lot of people doing restaurants with these big opening doors. There's a new requirement in 2021 to really be aware of about those operable opening interlockings. So this is saying when this big door is open, their mechanical system can't just be running, I'm not going to try to cool the building to 70 degrees when I have this big, huge opening to the outside. I need to interlock them. So that as a plan reviewer, I'm like, oh, I see this big door. This code is a system. Now I got to go to the mechanical section. Do they have the controls to shut the system back so it's not heating or cooling to their normal temperatures, right? So this just goes back to that code as a system type thinking. If you really look through it, it's going to have different requirements. So just keep those kind of things in mind. Same with mechanical ventilation controls. Used to be that only certain sizes of places had to have demand control ventilation. You size according to the mechanical code, but you bring in controls to shut things down when there's not that many people in the room. Why ventilate for 100 people when there's 2 in the room, right? Especially now with COVID and we don't have as many people in the room. So they expanded it. Make sure you read that section. Make sure you read that section because it's been expanded a lot to apply to all single zone systems that require economizers have to have this demand control ventilation. There are exceptions, but pay attention to it. Parking garages have new ventilation requirements. There's new requirements for energy recovery. So just read the code book. Lighting and power, I just want to talk about this real fast. I know we're running out of time, or we're out of time. Don't leave it to the electrical inspector. They're licensed to NEC. A lot of them are not looking at the energy code. We want to give chance for success for the building and for the building owner who's going to have to pay that bill. So at a minimum, we're going to put on there where those things are required or call out, hey, this isn't required, or you don't have your occupancy sensors correct for your storage space or your office space or whatever. There's a lot of different requirements now. So, you don't have those right. Here's what you need to do. Because the electrical inspector is looking, yes, it's all installed. It's at the right height. It's installed correctly. It's on the right circuit. It's da-da-da-da. But they're not looking at, is there an occupancy sensor required in this room? Or is there a daylighting thing in this room, right? So we need to call those out on the plans and make sure that they get them right. Make sure that you're making sure that the designer is doing the work, right? You show me where you need daylighting controls. You show me your window to wall calculation. You show me the calculations and I will make sure they're right. Right? If you turn this back enough times, they're going to get it right. If you don't turn it back, you're going to constantly be doing the calculations yourself. Help you, right? Make sure that you're sending it back. Hey, you're going to need daylighting. Show me where you need daylighting. And daylighting expanded in the 2021. It's even bigger areas. So make them turn it into you so that you get it right, right? Same with parking garages, new requirements there. So make sure that they're turning in those areas. Plant growth, this is just making sure that you're looking that it used to be not required and it is now, right? Get those right for the lighting, for the envelope, and for the mechanical. And then how are we going to do this, right? Making sure that somewhere on the plans, you have the ability to go through there, maybe sit with your electrical inspector or plan reviewer to just till you can come up with how does this need to look on the plans? What do I need to be seeing for controlled outlets? Certain occupancies, a lot of them require now controlled outlets. 50% of the outlets have to be able to shut off when the business is not open. What does that look like? Each outlet might have one or the other controlled or every other outlet. What does that look like? Get with your inspector or your planner, your electrical, and figure out what that needs to look like. And same with energy monitoring. What does that look like on the plan? Can they just say we're going to monitor? Do they need to put a system? There's a lot of requirements for that energy monitoring. It has to have a system. It has to actually report to something and they have to turn in reports. We need to kick those plans back and say, hey, identify how you're going to deal with this. Don't just put a stamp on there, right? We need to figure out, kick it back so that they are so aware of it, it becomes natural for them to do it. And lastly, for additional efficiency package options, you have all of these options depending on the kind of building you are, the climate zone you are, the different points. They have to get 10 points. So what am I doing in C406 now? What is the occupancy of the building? Is it a new tenant space? Because that has a different requirement. What is the climate zone? I need to pay attention to that. Are there anything in those, in any of those that they are required to do in a different chapter? I don't want to let them get points for that. They got to get 10 points without that. You know, what options did they choose? Did they turn in the right documentation for those options? If they said, we're going to do a DOAS system, okay, you don't just get the points for it. You actually have to show me your dedicated outdoor air system on the plans. Show me what, you know, I want to see it. So whatever they chose has to be on the plans. They're not just getting credit for it to pass. Did they get their 10 points, and how did they put that on the plan? So really pay attention to that. And then if you use a checklist, great. I just had a designer call me the other day. Can you send me the checklist you use? Well, you can go to the toolkit that Erica was talking about and get a checklist. There's a bunch of them on there. Here's the checklist I use. When I'm doing a residential or commercial, any code, I open every single code book. I go to the table of contents. Okay, this is going to apply. This isn't going to apply. This is going to apply. I better open this because I can't remember what it said. You know, this is the best checklist you're going to find is the table of contents. What applies, what doesn't. Oh, they didn't go performance. I don't even have to look in 405, right? Or whatever. I just use the table of contents as my checklist. I throw that on there because I had somebody ask me. So walk through the code, make sure the documents match and they're not giving themselves credit for something they have no intention of doing. Get everything together. The res check goes in the field with the plans. The performance report goes in the field with the plans. Anything they turn in goes in the field with the plans so that when I'm the inspector on the job site, I have everything the plan reviewer had. Right? And so I need all of it to go in the field, stamp it, reviewed for code compliance, and send it out the door. Sorry, I know that's probably not 100% what you were looking for. You want a full plan review, but there's no way to do it in that amount of time. Just going over high level here is what I find the most. So, Erica.
Thanks, Shauna. I know that was
it's a lot.
Push through the remainder of the presentation too. So we do have a few questions for you. And first one is, please confirm if Denver now follows the IECC 2021. When did it start? They are not the IECC 2021 yet. We are going into code hearings at the end of this month to make amendments to the 2021 codes in Denver. And then the follow-up question is, does this mean that we are not allowed to use any incandescent lighting since they all have to be high efficacy? I think it's 90% in 2018, but
the 2018 was 90%. That's 2021 is 100%. You could you trade it off? No. Yeah. Right, because it's part of that mandatory table in the trade-off path.
All right, next question. If you use IECC's premium digital codes, is it automatically updated in the most recent and best version?
Right. You know, that premium code version a lot of times does include the errata. I mean, it might not be on there the day the errata gets introduced, but they do what they do is what I noticed last time I used it. It's been a couple weeks, but they have the old code section there, but they have a little button to the side that shows that is errata, and you click on the errata and to see the errata. It would be nice if they just filled in, and they might by now, but last time I looked, they had a button there where the errata was posted.
Okay, and looks like last question. Can ResCheck and WriteSoft, as well as other programs similar, be used to perform the simulated performance path in the 2018 IECC as outlined in R405?
Okay, ResCheck, no. ResCheck only looks at the building thermal envelope, so you're not getting a true picture of the whole building. And so ResCheck is for that UA trade-off only. WriteSoft, however, is trying to create, WriteSoft is creating total building performance software. So that one you could probably use.
All right. Thank you very much, Shauna. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording now.